Vítam vás opäť pri našom vysielaní z Prahy z Globsecu a predstavujem vám, máme tu česť mať tu medzi nami pána Chertoffa, jedného z najvýznamnejších členov Rady Globsecu a tiež odborníka na bezpečnostné technológie. Budeme hovoriť o vojne na Ukrajine, o technológiách vo vojne a aj technológiách v hybridnej vojne. Thank you, Mr. Chertoff, for accepting the invitation. It's our honor to have you here, and well, let's start straight. The war has posed many challenges for the world. Well, some are military, some are political, diplomatic, some are technological. I think we should start with the military. How do you view the situation on the battlefield? How do you view the Kursk counter-offensive?
Well, first let me say I'm delighted to be here, and these are very important matters to talk about. And I begin by saying when we talk about the conflict in Ukraine, the invasion by Russia, obviously there's the classic military activity in the field, like, for example, the back and forth over Kharkiv or Kursk. But also now, because of the new technologies, the domains of conflict are not just on the physical battlefield, but they're in cyberspace and they're even in people's minds. And so we need to understand these are all part of the same general strategy that has to be dealt with. As far as the incursion into Kursk, I think that psychologically, what Ukraine has done is sent a message to Russia that if you're provoking a fight with us, you may not like the results, and you're not invincible, and you may wind up being vulnerable as well. And I think that, to some degree, undermines perhaps what Putin is counting on, which is marshaling support in his population. And so I think it's an important step. It doesn't relieve the fact that now the Russians have also made incursions more deeply into Ukraine. And the real question we have to ask is, as an American general famously asked once, how does this end? What is the way in which this unwinds? Or does this go on for years of what we used to call a frozen conflict?
Yeah, that's it. As for the Kursk, I would say even counter-offensive, I have the idea, or it's maybe a feeling, that it's the end game is very fluid. And it is part of the strategy not to specify the end game too much. So what do you feel, what do you think, the Ukrainians, how far can they go? What can they get away with?
Well, I mean, I think they've demonstrated they can certainly carry out attacks inside Russia. They've focused and targeted on those locations which are supporting attacks on Ukraine. So it's not that they're just randomly going into Russia, but they're targeting things that are part of the invasion itself. But I think initially there was a sense that it was an absolute no-go for Ukraine to physically have troops in Russia and in what is not simply former Ukrainian territory, but is actually in indigenous Russian territory. I think now that has been demonstrated to be not such a firm rule. And I think that's important because what it shows is that over time, both sides are going to wind up perhaps having to give way on things. And maybe the end game here is finally to make an arrangement with Putin where he understands he'll get some of his territory back, but he's got to give Ukraine its territory back.
Yes, exactly. It's Putin who says, we got to respect the situation on the battlefield, on the ground. Well, now you have something to respect, Mr. Putin.
Yeah, I think that's right. Now, you know, the big question is always how far will Putin go using military means to again regain the initiative. And he's been relatively forthright and blustering about how he has nuclear weapons, although he must realize that to do even a tactical nuclear attack would really be a red line, and it would also have collateral consequences for his own population as well as for his neighbors, and it might get out of control. So I'm cautiously optimistic that they're not going to actually do anything in that realm, but we may see more stepped-up attacks on civilian locations. I think there were missile attacks and drone attacks, and I think that's going to be part of what is the price that the civilian populations pay for this invasion that Russia started.
Yeah, that's true. I think as for the red lines we are so famously afraid of in the West, I think they have been crossed many times over, and well, there is nothing in return. Zero retaliation except for retaliation against Ukraine, of course, which saddens me deeply, but I think it's the price that Ukrainians are prepared to pay so far. Do you think so?
Well, I think that the problem is Ukrainians didn't ask to have this situation. It was thrust upon them by the Russian invasion. So at that point, you're no longer in a position to bargain about how you don't want to have civilians paying a heavy price, because that's how this all started, with the Russians attacking civilians. So now the question just becomes, how far do you go in revisiting that on the Russian population in order to defend yourself and to finally raise the cost so that the Russians may come to the table and abandon some of their imperialist plans?
Oh yeah. Now let's say something about technologies, because you're an expert on technology, and there are various new technologies tested and used on the battlefield in Ukraine. What are the most important ones? Is it drones or is it something else?
Well, I think that, obviously cyber attacks have been an important part of what's going on in the battlefield here, and that's nothing new. But I would say that among the new technologies that are getting a tryout in this conflict are drones, which we've known are useful, but maybe the different applications haven't been fully explored. I think we've come to understand that actually control of space and satellites becomes important. Early on, the Russians attacked the ability of satellite communications to be operated by the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians actually had to turn to, I think, Elon Musk's company in order to
initially got something from
correct, in order to get something initially, which he then took back, but that allowed them to keep their communications going forward. And one thing that I think we need to realize is that even when we talk about cyber conflict, that depends on the physical world, because there have to be hardware as well as software elements to what we do in cyberspace. So that means we're defending not only the ground, but we're defending outer space, we're defending this electronic media, and we're also defending undersea cables, because that's part of the global communication system. So again, what's simply happened is the complexity of the battlefield has been revealed and underscored by what we've actually seen in Ukraine.
True, absolutely. You mentioned the optical cables. It's something that one doesn't even think of, or doesn't even want to think of, because to me it seems it's like a very vulnerable structure connecting the civilization. Yeah. Is it true? Is it so vulnerable, or am I,
Well, I think it's vulnerable in two senses. First, because in many cases, a lot of the communication depends on a single cable or a single location where the cables come into land. It's a single point of failure. Yes. So there's not enough redundancy, which is one of the main ways you defend your technologies, to have redundancy. I also think there was at least one accidental incident where a cable got cut, and I think that revealed how easy it is to cause that kind of damage. And I do think that the Russians have been operating their submersible seacraft in the vicinity of where some of these cables are concentrated. And what they tend to do is, when they were originally built, because they weren't thinking about warfare, in many cases they're concentrated at a particular node as they then come up into the land area to be then connected to the IT world. So that means that if you identify that location, you can do a lot of disruption with a single blow.
You know, why weren't the builders thinking about warfare, as you said? Why? Because it's something unimaginable that optical cables, for our viewers, are something that connects the internet. And without it, not only we wouldn't be able to access Facebook, that's the least damage, but without internet, what would happen if these optical cables were targeted by Putin as a way of retaliation, for example? What would happen to us?
Well, I mean, it would bring down or cripple portions of the way the internet operates. And you know, now we've built so much of our economics as well as our military capability on the use of the internet that it wouldn't be, you know, the end of the world, but it would be a very damaging blow. In the same way, for example, that some of these low orbit satellites now have become very critical on things like global positioning systems and things we use to map or to track, and our ability to communicate and to find directions would be compromised if those were taken down. So, you know, it's too late now to unwind the dependence on technology, but the key then becomes build redundancy. You have to have a backup plan. So what happened when Russia invaded Ukraine, they did attack the databases of the Ukrainian government, but fortunately Ukraine had the foresight to move that data to a commercial cloud outside of its own borders. So they were able to reconstitute their government operations very quickly. And that's a great lesson in redundancy as a critical element of your defense strategy.
Definitely. Are we taking that lesson?
Well, I know in the US, there is a great deal of focus on that. And you see that even with things like the CHIPS Act, which are designed to onshore, or among our friends onshore, the development and creation of chips and semiconductors, which we use for some of our most sophisticated IT work. Because we realize if we depend simply on what we import from China, we're putting our economic and military future in the hands of China, and that's not a very prudent thing to do.
It's similar to being dependent on Russia for fuels.
Correct.
For raw materials, etc., etc. Yeah. So we are past that way of thinking that we can depend on our enemies and we can solve primarily political disputes through business.
Correct. And the idea that business operates heedless of what the national security implications are, I think, unless you're making children's toys, I think you have to take account of the fact that all of economics and all of the business activity does either have a vulnerability or an ability to promote national security, and therefore you have to consider that as part of your strategy for managing and regulating business.
I think during the Cold War we used to think like this, right? Why did we abandon this kind of thinking? And you know, we were so crazy about the peace revenues and about finally blowing off that nothing happens. We are past that and we can relax.
Well, as Frank Fukuyama famously wrote, we thought, or many people thought, it was the end of history. Finally, you know, heaven has arrived. We've got democracy will prevail. Everybody wants democracy. There will be peace. There will be no adversaries to the liberal democracies. No adversaries of substance. And it was just foolish optimism. It was wishful thinking as opposed to shrewd analysis.
Yeah, I think even Frank Fukuyama meant it the other way around.
Well, he said
perhaps that the human yearning for freedom and democracy is eternal, of course. Everybody more or less wants it, but also are its adversaries. So
I think he, yes, he's quite clear that it's not literally the end of history. It's, as we've seen lately, it's actually in many ways reverting to history that we had 100 years ago.
Yeah. You remember the Cold War, and many other people do. So, did somebody come to you after Russia did what it did? Well, and for advice? Did they ask you to compare your experience from back then, from the Cold War, and to apply it to this world, to this part of history? Because you know, there were whole departments of Kremlinology back then. Do we need something like that today? And
well, yeah.
Are we building it?
I think we're building it now, although I have to laugh a little bit because I remember when I was you know, starting out in government, and of course we had 9/11, and I got very involved in fighting counterterrorism at the Department of Justice and then Homeland Security, and there was a real call for Arabic speakers and people who understood the Middle East and understood the radical Islam and things of that sort. And I remember thinking, geez, when I was going to college, there were people interested in international affairs all wanted to learn Russian. And then the Cold War ended and suddenly Russians no use to them anymore. They should have learned Arabic instead. And shame on me, it turns out Russian is back.
Yeah.
And, you know, Arabic is still important too, but it never went away. Yeah. So it's always a mistake to assume that you're done and over with. There's always another chapter. And if you look around the world, in many ways we're reliving some of the experiences we had in the world in the 30s.
Definitely.
In terms of autocracy. And that reminds you that, as I think Mark Twain said, history may not repeat itself, but it rhymes.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much, Mr. Chertoff.
My pleasure.
I'm so honored that you spoke for us here and that you answered our questions. Well, have a good day at Globsec and in Prague.
Thank you.